Hello there and welcome back to another video. In today's video, I'm going to be doing a review of the ThermalMaster P1 thermal camera, which was provided to me for free by ThermalMaster for the sake of creating this video. And I want to be clear about that right off the bat. Now, although I received this product for free, all opinions are my own, and ThermalMaster does not get to see this video before you do. In any case, while I could do a basic, boring review of this thermal camera, I'm actually going to be doing something a little different. Today, I'll be reviewing the P1, but I'll be doing so while actively comparing it in all the use cases I test to my much more expensive Topdon TC002C. The ThermalMaster P1 is listed on Amazon for a retail price of $139 US, whereas the Topdon TC002C is usually listed for $319 US, though it can often be found on a decent sale, bringing it down to around $240. Even then, this makes the P1 a much cheaper thermal camera than the TC002C, and when looking on Amazon, if you exclude all of the standalone thermal cameras with their tiny screens and handles, and only look at thermal cameras intended for use with a phone, the ThermalMaster P1 is one of the cheapest options on the market. So let's get the P1 out of its box and see what kind of accessories it comes with, and how those compare to the TC002C. Inside the box, there's a small zippered hard case with the thermal camera inside. There's also a USB-C extension cable so that you can reach the thermal camera into places you might not be able to stick your phone into while still being able to see the display. ThermalMaster also sent me an Apple Lightning to USB connector converter, presumably so that you can use this thermal camera with a phone that has a Lightning port on it. This isn't included stock with the P1, but it's nice to know that you can use this thermal camera with an older Lightning port iPhone if you have one of those. And while we're speaking of phone compatibility, the P1 is compatible with both Lightning and USB-C iPhones, as well as with Android phones. This can be compared to the TC002C, which is only supposed to work with an iPhone, though Topdon now only seems to have the TC002C Duo model available, which is supposed to work with both types of phones. Now, let's compare the camera itself and the accessories it came with to the Topdon. Right off the bat, the storage case is a lot smaller with the P1, which I honestly quite appreciate. I never saw the Topdon size as an issue, but the P1's case is definitely more pocketable than the Topdon's is. Keeping on with the trend of being smaller, the actual P1 thermal camera itself is slightly more compact than the Topdon is. Additionally, it's a fair bit lighter as well, likely due to the fact that the Topdon has much more aluminum in its construction. Both cameras have nice, long USB-C connectors that shouldn't interfere with most phone cases, but the ThermalMaster has a noticeably longer USB-C plug by at least a millimeter or two, which might help it out with some chunkier phone cases. And finally, for the physical comparison, I noticed that the P1's lens is a lot smaller than the TC002C's lens is. This isn't too surprising, considering that the native resolution of the P1 is only 160 by 120 compared to the TC002C's resolution of 256 by 192, but still something interesting to know. And I think that's enough physical comparison of the two cameras for the time being. So let's get the P1's app installed and check it out. Both the ThermalMaster camera and the Topdon require third-party apps to work on my iPhone. The Topdon requires Top Infrared, and the new app that I'm installing for the P1 is called TempMaster. After opening the app, the camera started working right away, and it seems there's a very solid selection of settings to mess around with, so that you can easily get the measurements that you need from this thermal camera. When comparing this to the Top Infrared app, I noticed no deal-breaking differences in terms of features between the two apps, and honestly think, and this is just speculation, that there's a good chance that they're both just reskins of some general-purpose source app. So with that, let's check out some initial impressions with both of these cameras. Starting with the main subject of the video, the P1, I was pretty easily able to see the temperature of my hands in relation to my desk, how the heat from my hands soaked into the desk for a while after I removed my hand, and I could also see the hot spots on my DIY lighting controller for my filming lights. However, this camera was a noticeably lower resolution in comparison to the Topdon, and this is with the default upscaled resolution for the P1 enabled compared to the Topdon, where I'm using its native resolution instead of its upscaling mode. However, considering the price difference between the two, I think that the resolution gap between the two cameras isn't all too surprising. Alright, so a pretty solid first impression for the P1, again keeping its price in mind. Now, let's get into some more specific use cases to compare these two cameras and see how the P1 performs. Starting out with a very common use case for thermal cameras, looking at PCBs to find components that get hot. This here is my DIY PC power supply tester project, and I'll be using this as the PCB that I'll look at with these two thermal cameras to evaluate the P1's performance. Taking a look at this board with the P1 first, I could definitely see the parts of the board that were getting hot while testing a power supply. However, the overall outlook wasn't super detailed, and I think this is definitely in part due to the resolution of this camera being lower. However, I also think a large portion of this is actually due to the way that the app is scaling the range of colors with the temperature range, causing much lower contrast at times than would really be helpful. Overall though, I could definitely get the information that I needed out of the thermal camera, though I had to be more particular about my framing and which parts of the PCB were included in it to get the best contrast. Moving up to the much more expensive Topdon camera, looking at this same PCB, it's clear that the extra money spent on a more expensive camera does actually go somewhere, as the contrast is much better and the image is far more detailed due to the higher resolution. And remember, this is even while using the resolution upscaling on the P1, but not on the Topdon. So yeah. Unsurprisingly, the more expensive camera does better here, especially considering how detailed PCBs are. But the P1 holds up well for the price and is absolutely capable of providing a useful diagnostic when looking at a PCB. You might just have to get in closer and be more intentional about where exactly you're pointing the camera to get the best contrast to easily extract the data you need. Alright. Let's look at another scenario, which is actually really similar to this last one, but just a bit bigger and therefore a little less resolution dependent. Here I'll be taking a look at an old desktop computer, and starting with the P1, one thing that I noticed is that it's really hard to make out anything until the computer is turned on. Again, I think due to the lower contrast in the app's processing. However, once the PC is powered up, we can easily see all of the hot spots on the motherboard, and as time goes on, you can also see the CPU fan heat up as the hot air from the CPU moves through it. Once more, a very usable result. Now let's check how the Topdon does here, and like with the previous test, it definitely does a lot better. At the start, before the PC is powered on, it's very noticeable that the higher resolution and better processing in the app make a difference with the Topdon, as you can actually make out much more of the PC's components and their shapes than with the P1. Once the PC is powered up though, and there's a lot more difference between the temperatures of the different components, other than being maybe a tiny bit prettier, there's really not much of an advantage over the P1 with the Topdon, as you can make out all of the different hotspots just as easily on the TC002C as on the P1. So, as I kind of expected with this test, moving to a larger scale object much reduced the limitations seen with the lower resolution on the P1, which were quite accentuated when looking at an intricate PCB with SMD components and small traces. Moving on to the next thing now, once more going up in scale just to see how these cameras compare on larger objects, here's a bit of a curveball, a digital mixing console. Yeah, I was working with this console and just ended up with the thought in my head of, what if I use this as a benchmark for the thermal cameras I'm working with in this video? So I did. Starting with the P1, reading the text on the front of the mixer that says Studio Live 32SC was doable but quite difficult. And while the faders were pretty easily visible and the slots that they ride in were also quite easy to see, making out details on the back of the mixer and its ports was definitely a challenge. So let's see how a more expensive thermal camera performs in this use. Here, the TC002C performed really well, providing a lot more detail in the text, and I was actually able to make out the pins in the male XLR connectors on the back of the mixer. Now, with all of that said, I still think that the P1 performed perfectly fine for what most people are doing, as it's unlikely you're trying to read text in your thermal camera, and also, if you need more detail, you're likely to position yourself in a way that allows you to get a lot closer to the subject. And I guarantee if I had gotten closer to the XLR connectors with the P1, I could have made out the same level of detail. As for motion rendering with the flying faders, I didn't really notice a meaningful difference between these two cameras in this case. But the next test is about to give both of these cameras a run for their money in this department. Starting with the P1 as always, here I took a look at my Creality K1 Max 3D printer while it was printing a model. I was honestly quite impressed with the P1's ability to accurately represent the motion of the print head, meaning that if you're looking at things with your thermal camera that move a bunch, it's not going to turn into some kind of stuttery or blurry mess. The Topdon also performed very well in this test. However, the most noticeable difference between the two cameras was, as we've seen a lot so far, just the resolution, and not much to do with the motion rendering. So hey, again, a very solid performance from the P1 for the price. Now let's check out the final test that I'll be running on these cameras, which is very different from what I've looked at up until this point. And that is taking a look at an exterior door in my house to see how drafty it is around the seal. Thermal cameras can be really useful for a whole lot of stuff regarding plumbing, HVAC, and general construction, so I figured this was a valuable test to include. When comparing the P1 to the Topdon in this test, I have to be honest, I think that in terms of usability, they performed identically. They both got me the exact same information on how leaky the door was, and while maybe the Topdon had a technically higher quality image, that didn't affect the interpretability of the information in this test, unlike in some others. And I didn't have to go out of my way to use the P1 in a more effective or careful manner to get the same information out of it. And that concludes my comparison between these two thermal cameras. So what do I think of the P1, and how does it compare to the TC002C? Well, I think that it's important to remember that the P1 is definitely a budget thermal camera option, being one of the cheapest ones available on the market. The Topdon, on the other hand, is a much higher end thermal camera, making these two cameras fundamentally different products, as they aim at different segments of the market. And of course, because of this, it should be no surprise that the Topdon outperforms the ThermalMaster in basically every single test. It should. It's a camera that costs over twice as much. But just because the P1 gets outperformed by a more expensive camera does not mean that the P1 performs badly at all. In fact, in all of the tests performed today, I was still able to get very usable results out of the P1 that provided all of the information I needed from the thermal camera. When I reach for a thermal camera, maybe I need to see a hot spot on a PCB and get a rough temperature readout of how hot it is. Or maybe I want to see how heat is flowing in a cooling system. And when grabbing the P1, I was able to do this just fine. Sometimes I had to finagle the angle a little more just to make the most use out of the lower contrast with this camera, but I was still able to do so quite easily. So I think that if you need a thermal camera and are on a bit of a tighter budget, because thermal cameras are generally just expensive tools, or because you don't want to spend a ton of money on a product you may not use too much, I think that the P1 is honestly a great option that I can recommend. I'll definitely be gifting this P1 to my dad so that he can have access to a thermal camera for checking ceiling and windows and doors, as well as general heat flow in a house, among other things, and I think for that, it will do amazingly. If you're interested in picking up a P1, check out the links in the video description, and down there, there's also a discount code for an even better price on the P1 than it already is. Well, that's all that I have for you in today's video. I hope that you were able to at least enjoy it, and maybe even learn a thing or two. In any case, I hope to see you next time. Goodbye.